793 years after Christ, in early June, a fifth ship sailing from the opposite shore of the Northern Sea launched an attack on St. Cuthbert's Monastery on the island of Lindisfarne in eastern England. Valuables were looted, most of the monks were killed, and the monastery was set on fire. It is known that Vikings made some attacks on England before that. However, because this attack targeted a monastery, it shocked people of Europe at the time. Today, historians accept this bloody attack as the beginning of the Viking Age. For the next 5 centuries, the Vikings ravaged Europe. England was gradually invaded from 865 onwards. At the beginning of the 11th century, it came under the rule of a Danish king. In France, a semi-independent Norman domination was established in the region known today as Normandy. By the year 1000, traces of Vikings could be seen everywhere, from the most remote corners of the North Atlantic to the busiest ports of the Mediterranean. However, the Viking Age finally came to an end when Harald Hardrada died in a failed invasion of England in 1066. Historical records became stories, and stories became legends. During the 13th and 14th centuries, sagas describing the legendary kings of the Viking Age were written in many northern European countries, especially Iceland. Some of these sagas talk about a king who ruled Sweden and Denmark and raided France and England. He was the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok. Most of the sagas describing Ragnar Lothbrok connect his lineage to the legendary Scandinavian king Ivar Vidfam, who ruled Sweden and Denmark for many years. 2 children, Harald and Randver, were born from the marriage of Ivar's daughter, Odd, with one of the Slavic kings, Valdar. After Randver's death, his son Sigurd took his place. After the death of the great king Ivar, Harald became the king of Denmark and his nephew Sigurd became the king of Sweden. From the limited information given in the epics, it is understood that Sigurd ruled in Sweden for a while under his uncle Harald. However, this state did not last long. In the Battle of Bravalla between the two sides, Harald lost both his army and his life. Denmark and Sweden were united again under a single king. In different versions of Icelandic sagas, different details are provided about Sigurd. Some say that he was the king of Sweden alone, while other sources claim that he ruled both Denmark and Sweden. He eventually got married to Alfhild, the princess of the small Alfheim kingdom in the south of Norway. Ragnar Lothbrok was born as a result of this marriage. The sagas about Ragnar focus both on his private life and his heroism on the battlefield. The women he married are portrayed as characters with extraordinary qualities. His first wife is Thora, whom Ragnar won the right to marry by killing a white snake. Another is Lagertha, who participated with him in bloody battles and plundering expeditions across the sea, but whose name is only mentioned in the Gesta Danorum, a 12th century Danish history book. His third wife is Oslog, the daughter of the dragon slayer Sigurd and the warrior virgin Brunhild, the subject of the most vivid love story of the Scandinavian world. Ragnar had at least 8 children from these marriages. Among them, Ivar, Bjorn, Abba, Halfdan and Sigurd are the most famous. According to the sagas, each of these children grew up to become famous Viking warriors. In time, their fame spread all over Scandinavia, so much so that Ragnar's heroism was overshadowed by the fame of his children. Indignant at this situation, Ragnar finally left Scandinavia with 3 ships, taking his most trusted men with him. His aim was to invade England with a small number of men and regain his old-time reputation. But this time it turned into a complete disaster. Aela, ruler of the Kingdom of Northumbria in the north of England, captured Ragnar, with whom he had a personal grudge. He had witnessed the exploits of the famous Viking king for years, and he thought that no weapon could kill him. So he executed Ragnar, by throwing him into a pit full of snakes. England had faced dozens of disasters from the North Sea, but what was approaching now was like the apocalypse itself. Ragnar's sons, filled with anger and hatred, set sail for England with thousands of men and hundreds of ships to avenge their father's death. In a few years, Ayla would die and the Vikings would take over most of England. Other Icelandic sagas and epic poems tell a similar story. The saga of Ragnar is adorned with the fantastic elements of typical medieval heroic tales. For example, some records say that Ragnar fought a dragon to obtain Torah. Because of such fantastic narratives, historians are more skeptical about the authenticity of Ragnar's story than of his reality. In addition, considering that almost all of these sagas were written about 300 years after Ragnar's lifetime, it will be better understood how difficult it is to reveal a historical Ragnar figure. So, how can the story of the real Ragnar Lothbrok be traced at this point? Or, you have to ask, can myth and truth, tightly knotted in all these stories, be loosened enough to be discerned? We actually have a starting point for doing this, but surprisingly, to get to Ragnar the Real, we need to examine the records written about his sons rather than Ragnar's own story, because they are the most real thing we have about Ragnar Lothbrok. Today's research tells us that some of the men mentioned in the medieval sources as Ragnar's sons actually lived. For example, we know that Bjorn Ironside raided some cities along the banks of the Seine in 857 and 875. Ivar and Ubbe were among the leaders of the great Viking army that invaded England in 865. Ivar is thought to have died during a battle in Dublin in 873 and Ubbe around Devon in 878. The activities of these famous leaders of the Viking Age appear abundantly in the records of the 9th century. In short, we know that they are real historical figures. However, we run into a problem when we compare sagas with real records. In the sagas, these Viking leaders who terrorized medieval Europe are mentioned as the sons of Ragnar. On the other hand, the Anglo-Saxon and Frankish records of the 9th century do not give sufficient information about the fathers of these men. Moreover, it is not possible to confirm that historical figures such as Bjorn, Ivar, Halfdan, Ubbe, and Sigurd were brothers. Sources describe them as war leaders who acted independently of each other. So, how was this bond established over the years? Now, let's try to follow that up as far as historical records allow. The first historical record mentioning Ragnar is a manuscript written around 1070 by the Norman historian William. William says that the father of the famous Viking king Bjorn Ironside was a man named Lothbrok. The name Lothbrok reappears a few years later. The chronicler Adam of Bremen writes that Lothbrok was the father of the curial king Ivar, who had invaded England. In the 1120s, Icelandic writer Ari Thorgilsson used the name Ragnar Lothbrok for the first time. By the 12th century, Ragnar's stories became circulating legends. The greatest warriors of the 9th century are described as his sons. From this moment on, Ragnar turned into a legendary character rather than a historical figure. Aside from all this, historians continue to focus on a few figures that could be described as the true Ragnar. The most widely accepted candidate is a Danish Viking leader named Ragnar, who besieged Paris in 845. We don't know much about Ragnar, except that he crossed the Seine with a fleet of 120 ships and plundered some of the cities in this region with his 4,000 men. 9th century Frankish records say that he was a brutal and vicious man. The fact that he captured 111 men of the Frankish army and executed them on an island in the Seine must undoubtedly have contributed to this image. Another candidate for Ragnar is a man named Lothbrok, mentioned in the Neots Chronicles. The English, who won the Battle of Kinwith in 878, captured a banner called the Raven while sacking the Viking camp. According to the Chronicles of St. Neots, this banner was woven by the daughters of a man named Lothbrok. Another candidate is a Viking leader named Ragnar in Gesta Danorum, but there are historians who suggest that this man is the same man as Ragnar who attacked Paris in 845. Frankish records say that the king, named Ragnar, died in Denmark after leaving France. However, in Gesta Danorum, it is recorded that Ragnar made a great expedition to Dublin in 851. If these two are the same person, it seems that Ragnar did not die as early as in Frankish sources. Despite all these nominations, historians have a far more interesting idea of Ragnar. Accordingly, Ragnar is actually not a single person. Who knows, maybe there are men among them who appear in historical records such as Ragnar, Ragnar, or Lothbrok, but it is not possible to predict exactly by whom the works attributed to Ragnar were performed. At this point, we have to ask the most crucial question: why did sagas create such a hero? Why was this needed? Throughout history, we see that rulers based their ancestry on legendary figures, even mythological figures, in order to rise and gain legitimacy. For example, the Spartan kings were descended from the Greek hero Hercules, and Romulus, the founder of Rome, descended from Mars, the god of war. History is full of examples like these, and many of these stories were deliberately made up by members of the dynasty who wanted to firmly establish their power. Today, historians think that some Viking kings, starting from 900s, resorted to a similar way to consolidate their power. Guthrum, who invaded England between 880 and 890, and Knut, who reigned as King of England, Norway, and Denmark at the beginning of the 11th century, were among these kings. In particular, any king who wished to invade or hold England claimed to be descended from Ragnar and claimed rights over the lands his sons had conquered. Let us now come to the last periods of the Viking Age. Many of the kings who invaded England during these years felt the need to trace their lineage to the Viking kings of the past in order to legitimize their rule. The fittest among these kings were the Viking leaders who invaded England in 865. However, at one point in history, instead of making use of them one by one, the idea arose to create a legendary Viking lineage by combining them all on a common note. After that, it was left to the imaginary power of some historians close to the kings. The famous Viking leaders who invaded England were finally united under one man's households. All the great kings were united in his lineage. This man's name was Ragnar Lothbrok. Was he a real historical figure? Did Ragnar really live? It is very difficult to answer these questions nowadays, because the available data do not allow us to make a definite judgment about how much of Ragnar's story is true and how much of it is a myth. However, to give an answer, it should be remembered that historians are more skeptical of the stories attributed to Ragnar than of the reality of Ragnar himself. This turned Ragnar we know today into a largely legendary character.